Welcome to this first part of the screencast on professionalism and the GPhC. My name's Dan Grant, as I haven't met you before. I'm School Director of Teaching and Learning, but I teach within pharmacy practice, and I'm a hospital pharmacist by background, and I still work in practice 1 day a week. So I'll see you much more probably in the spring term when you start doing your dispensing classes, as I'm very involved in that. So within this screencast, I'm going to be covering the role of the GPhC, so the General Pharmaceutical Council, and the pharmacy professional bodies, and also I'm going to introduce the concept of a profession and professionalism. This will build on some of the things that I think you will have covered in your Welcome Week sessions, so where you were told about things like fitness to practice, and I think you talked about what you would expect of a pharmacist. So in terms of the learning outcomes, so the things that you should be able to do after listening to the two parts of the screencast. So you should be able to define the terms profession, professional, and pharmacy professionalism. You should be able to describe the attributes, values, and behaviours that are expected of healthcare professionals. You should be able to describe the functions of the GPhC. You should be able to explain how the GPhC ensures the safety of patients and the public in its regulation of pharmacists and pharmacy technicians. And you should be able to describe the role of the pharmacy professional bodies, such as the RPS and APT UK. So to start off with, I'm just going to talk a bit about the General Pharmaceutical Council. So within pharmacy, we have two main bodies which look after us as such. So the first is the General Pharmaceutical Council that you'll have heard about before, and this is the regulatory body. And they look after pharmacists and pharmacy technicians. So that's the body that basically makes sure that we do what we're supposed to do and don't misbehave. Then there's also the Royal Pharmaceutical Society, so the RPS, and they're our professional body, and they look after pharmacists only. So there is a separate body that looks after pharmacy technicians, and that's APT UK, the Association of Pharmacy Technicians in the United Kingdom. So it's important to understand the difference between the two. So as I said, the regulatory body is there to make sure that we do what we're supposed to do and to protect the public, whereas the professional body is there to promote the profession and to support its members. So to think a bit more about the GPhC. So the GPhC came into being in 2010. So on the legal basis under which it works is the Pharmacy Order 2010, and that set the GPhC up as an independent statutory regulator. So the council of the GPhC, they have the powers and the responsibilities of registering pharmacy premises and enforcing provisions under the Medicines Act 1968 and the Poisons Act 1972. So they're two of the sort of classic legal acts that cover a lot of the things that we do with medicines and the way that we look after them. So the GPhC registers pharmacy premises. They also register pharmacists and pharmacy technicians. So as I've mentioned, the GPhC is a regulatory body, so they govern pharmacists, pharmacy technicians and pharmacy premises. And their whole reason for being is to protect the public. So protecting, promoting and maintaining the health, of the safety and well-being of patients, the public and anybody who's using a pharmacy service. So their whole focus is really about patient and public safety. So the ways in which it does this is through its regulatory functions. So like I mentioned, you see the first one that we've got on the list is protecting public safety. So things like fitness to practice, so making sure that pharmacists and pharmacy technicians are fit to work in a safe way. They also set standards for education and training. So the program that you're studying, the MPharm, is covered by the GPhC, and we have to meet certain standards that they set, and they also sort of check up to make sure that we are meeting those at all times. I've mentioned that they register pharmacists and pharmacy technicians, and as part of that they set standards of conduct and performance, which you should have heard about already, because they also apply to you as pharmacy students. Sort of linking in with that, so they also set standards which are applied to the owners and superintendents of registered pharmacies. So people who own a pharmacy or are overall responsible for a chain of pharmacies, then there are standards which apply to them as well. GPhC also registers the pharmacies, the actual sites themselves, make sure that they meet the standards that they expect, and they carry out inspections to make sure that the pharmacies are being run in the right way. And obviously, if those standards are not being met, then they need to take action to put things in place to improve the pharmacist's practice, for example, or to improve the premises. So they have a few different committees which helps them in their duties. So the main ones that we tend to think about are the statutory committees. So these are the committees that carry out the regulatory functions, so the functions that they are responsible for under the law. And that's mainly things like the fitness to practice and dealing with registration. So the first one on the list is the investigating committee. So if there's somebody puts in a complaint about a pharmacist, or there are any concerns about a pharmacist or pharmacy technician's work, then they might be referred to the investigating committee, who will look at the case and decide whether or not that person needs to be referred to the fitness to practice committee. So then the second one on the list is that fitness to practice committee, and that is the committee that would listen to the case, invite the pharmacist or the pharmacy technician to a hearing, would consider all of the evidence, and that they would then make the decision as to whether the person was fit to practice or not. And then there's an appeals committee. So if somebody is taken through a fitness to practice committee and doesn't think that the outcome is fair, then they can appeal to the GPhC through this committee. There are also 4 non-statutory committees. So these are the sort of the committees that work in the background, as it were, just to help things go along. So there's an audit and risk committee. So they are really looking at the way the GPhC functions. So they'll audit the way that it works, the procedures that they follow and the processes they follow, and make sure that they're not putting anybody at risk in terms of, are they making the correct types of decisions in the fitness to practice committee meetings, for example. Then there's a remuneration committee. So they're, as you might expect from the name, they're the ones who decide on remuneration. So payment of fees to people who maybe work for the GPhC and so on. There's the appointments committee, and that's the committee that's responsible for any appointments to the statutory committees. So the people that are appointed to the investigating committee, the fitness to practice committee, and the appeals committee, all of those are carried out by the appointments committee or overseen by them. And then lastly, there's the finance and planning committee. And again, you can kind of tell from the name as to what they do, but they look after the money side of things and make sure that they're planning for the future in the way that the GPhC needs to work. So to move on to have a little think about what we mean by being a profession or a professional. So first of all, we'll think about what is a profession. So when you think about that term, you might think it's maybe somebody's job, or you might think it's the place that they work in that makes a profession. It might be an identity, or it might be a culture. So maybe different ways of thinking about it. So if we go to the dictionary for a definition, then a profession is described as a paid occupation, and particularly one that involves prolonged training. So you guys doing your 4 years undergraduate degree and a year in pre-reg, and a formal qualification. So you have to have the degree in order to be able to work as a pharmacist, for example. So within the Medicines Ethics and Practice Guide, which is a guide that's produced by the Royal Pharmaceutical Society, profession is described as, number 1, an occupation that's recognised by the public as being a profession. Number 2, an occupation for which there's a recognised representative professional body. So for pharmacists, there's the Royal Pharmaceutical Society. An occupation that benefits from professional standards and codes of conduct, and we know that that applies to pharmacists. So we've got the standards for pharmacy professionals. And lastly, an occupation that's regulated to ensure the maintenance of those standards and the codes of conduct. So we're regulated by the GPhC. So you can see that pharmacy, or being a pharmacist, falls under each of those criteria. So then if we think about being a professional, this is more about the attributes that you would expect from somebody who is working in a profession. So for somebody who's working as a pharmacist, what would you expect of them? So before moving on to the second part, just write down as many attributes that you can think of that you would expect to see in somebody who is a professional. And some of these might be things that you came up with in Welcome Week when you're having some of the discussions about what you might expect of a pharmacist. So have a think about that, and then once you've done, just for a few minutes, and then once you've done that, start part 2 of this screencast.